Welcome to this episode of Silicon Bites. Given that it's Easter, I think the theme of this episode is rather relevant. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and of course, thank you to everybody who helped support the trips and events so far this year in support of Ukraine. Your support is vital and it's of massive assistance in helping us to keep this work going. A man who's been called Trump's spiritual advisor visited Ukraine and then seemed to have a revelation. Putin is pure evil, he pronounced in his verdict on Russia's war against Ukraine. Televangelist Pastor Mark Burns declared, "I now believe that supporting Ukraine is America first." He is now urging the US to send Kyiv more tanks, fighter jets, and air defences. This is a dramatic turnaround because only last month, when Trump paused military aid to Ukraine, Pastor Mark Burns backed the decision. Burns's dramatic shift in stance comes after a trip to Ukraine. There he witnessed the atrocities committed by Russia firsthand, visiting the site of a missile attack in Kryvyi Rih, which killed 20 people, including 9 children. "Being on the ground in Ukraine has changed my opinion significantly," said Burns in an interview with the Kyiv Independent. "I am on record as being one of the staunchest opponents of supporting Ukraine, but it took me being in Kyiv, being at Bucha, seeing the atrocities that have taken place, innocent lives being killed, executed. Well, there is another dimension to this, which it's important to communicate to a wider audience in America, and this relates to Russia's violence against believers and against religious institutions that it cannot control. Because, of course, the church in Moscow, after the Moscow Patriarch, that is very much controlled by Russia's security services. Knowing the nearly 700 religious institutions have been intentionally targeted by the Russians and 20,000 children who've been kidnapped and deported to Russia, not including the 1.3 million children that are unaccounted for. Hearing these atrocities changed my perspective significantly," Burns said. "I now believe that supporting Ukraine is America first." Burns is careful to distance his support for Ukraine from any hint of criticism of Trump. "My support for Ukraine is not a stab at him, Trump, but a call to every Republican, every conservative, every American, and those around the world who, like me, have been brainwashed by fake news media about Ukraine." Calling the podcasters and so-called journalists that parrot Moscow's talking points fake news is an extraordinary thing to hear from someone so close to Trump. For instance, fake news suggested that Ukraine hated churches, Ukraine hated ministries, that they intentionally destroyed ministries. Well, that is a bold-faced lie, because I was among some of Ukraine's greatest spiritual leaders from all different sects, religious organizations, in one room in Kiev, and they all have the same common ground. They have the right to practice their faith in Ukraine. There are two things that Burns identifies that are crucial for change: seeing the reality on the ground and losing a partisan perspective on the war, not using this as a political football, and especially not seeing it as Biden's war. When I was on the ground and you're talking to these people, and once you see the atrocities at the hands of the Russians, politics goes out of the window. Just a couple of days ago, 9 children were killed, more innocent lives lost at the hands of Russians. My heart as a man of God begins to pour out, and I've been echoing that message ever since, that I was wrong. And the power of the cross teaches me to admit when you're wrong, to have a humbled heart, and to say, I was wrong. This seems to me to be unique amongst current voices. You rarely, if ever, hear that on the Republican side. Let's not be partisan about this, though. There are few on the Democrat side willing to admit either that they made terrible mistakes in the handling of the war and in deterrence towards Russia prior to the full-scale war. Jake Sullivan, for instance, has been on stage once more defending the indefensible and making the case for his disastrous escalation management. Nobody paid me to go to Ukraine. I paid for my own tickets to get to Ukraine. Nobody bought me there with the hope that I would communicate their message, protests Burns. Russia fears President Donald Trump, and they should, because I know him very deeply, very personally, and is a man of true conviction. This is simply human beings being destroyed at the hands of the Russians, and that's why my heart has now become a staunch supporter of supporting Ukraine. The key question for us, of course, is will this have an impact? His rhetoric is certainly a positive sign. I'm now echoing this message at the highest levels of government. I'm now echoing this message at the highest levels of government in the United States, Burns says, and around the world, that we need to get behind Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor. And of course, what is identified here is that Russia is at a critical phase of its transformation into a militarized dictatorship. But it is also running out of resources. Burns really seems to understand elements of this situation after visiting Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is at the end of his rope. I think that he has tested the patience of President Donald Trump and he's come to the end of it. I'm leaving the negotiations to the professionals, Burns says, the ones that Trump has appointed. But he concludes that Vladimir Putin is evil, pure evil. As a former United States South Carolina Army National Guard member, and having been a trained infantryman, I understand attacking military strategic positions that house military outposts. But to attack civilians, the elderly, women, children, hospitals, schools, this is beyond military advancement. That is just pure evil. And that is what Vladimir Putin's done. Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and they have been ruthlessly, relentlessly attacked by an aggressor called Russia, led by a man, dictator Vladimir Putin. It is evil, and it should never be allowed. Well, the key to this, and why I'm making this episode in particular, is to help American audiences understand more about Russia's campaign against religious institutions and groups in Ukraine, including evangelical Christians. The work of Stephen Moore and others is taking this same approach, and it seems to be yielding some results. Burns continues, "You would not be saying no to more money for Ukraine if you were here on the ground. When you're on the ground in Ukraine and you're seeing the devastation and you're seeing the tears and you're seeing the soldiers who are on the ground, they don't want money from America. They want ammunition. They need the tools to protect their homeland. They were invaded. It's no different from the British invading America. Those citizens took up arms. They were not trained soldiers. They were just regular farmers and blacksmiths, and they took up arms to defend their territory. That's exactly what Ukraine is doing. When you see this, you can hear the passion in my heart. This may politically kill me, and I could not care less. I don't care. It's not about what's popular. It's about what is right. I can tell you the spirit of Ukraine is not broken. It is very much alive and is very much ready to defend its homeland. But more importantly than ammo, they want peace. And this is the crucial message to end on, the crucial message of Burns' interview. Ukraine wants peace. It always has, a just and sustainable peace. Putin wants war because his ambitions are greater than Ukraine. But without Ukraine, those ambitions cannot even start to be fulfilled. And if Putin is not stopped, he will not stop. And the same war and suffering will come to other territories and other countries.